Hello to everybody in the room. Good afternoon, good morning. My name is Kelly Kester. I'm currently the Director of Portfolio Strategy and Planning for Advanced Therapy Solutions at Cardinal Health. That's our dedicated startup and COE to cell and gene therapies at Cardinal. But I started out my career on the patient care units of Rush University Medical Center in Chicago. So I'm a dietitian by training, former clinical researcher, who asked too many questions about science, but also about business to continue to work in clinical for my entire career. So, but I do always go back to those clinical roots. What do we need for patients, but what do we need for healthcare providers and care teams to be able to execute on these innovations that are happening in the space, so well placed and so well deserved. But from there, have consulted for genomics companies, CROs, made my way through the space, just like Jason had mentioned, and through asking too many questions, I think, happened upon blockchain in the DeSci space, and really have taken it upon myself to learn. It's just a really interesting space. But through there, part of my job today, and what I think what we'll get into is, I'm really trying to figure out what we need to be doing to make sure that our space is ready for the impending flood of innovative emerging therapies that are complex, that are more expensive, but are more impactful for patients today. So excited to be here.
Awesome. Thanks, Kelly. Gerald, please give your background and what you're up to now. I did preview the audience that you were both a health tech VC, so you've had to have this ecosystem perspective where compliance is a big factor in whether startups that you funded would ever get customers. And then now you're actually a DeFi lawyer who works with DAOs, and that's incredibly relevant since in healthcare so much contracting is about liability and indemnification and knowing who to pick up the phone to call when there's a problem, and ultimately knowing who to sue if the problem doesn't get fixed. And that's something that DAO-mediated DeSci has got to start facing at some point. So please give us your background.
Yeah, absolutely. Excuse me. Thanks, Jason. And yeah, again, really wish we could be there in person, but excited to be participating. So as Jason mentioned, I was spent the first sort of 5 years of my career in venture, and most recently in the healthcare space as a manager at HealthWorks, which is a fund funded by CareFirst, Blue Cross Blue Shield. So we were doing primarily kind of Series A, Series B investments. I also had a fund of funds allocation, so investing in other emerging managers. I started that program while we were at HealthWorks to get eyes on kind of earlier stage initiatives and potential investments. And so, yeah, I'd say, in terms of blockchain and sort of the DeSci space, I'd always been very interested in sort of distributed technology. I think, one of the really interesting but really frustrating parts of healthcare is sort of how slowly the technological innovation side of things moves, right? Because of some of the parameters that Jason was describing, whether it's legacy systems or complex regulations or compliance mechanisms, the ability to move fast and break things, I think, does not mesh with healthcare very well. So I got interested in blockchain, and then probably in 2020, I moved full-time into the space as in-house counsel. And so I've spent a little over a year now as general counsel and COO of a company called Nation, we founded by one of the early team members at Solana Labs. And we focus on kind of DAO formation. And DAO, it's interesting, and hopefully we can dig into this a bit more, but DAO has always been a bit of a misnomer to me. These organizations don't necessarily pop up out of the ground and autonomously kind of run themselves, right? So the way we like to think about it is actually on-chain entities, and I think that blends pretty well with some of the structure that you need to function effectively as an organization. So things like governance, treasury management, all those sorts of avenues are what we do, what we work with companies on.
Fantastic, thank you. So I'm going to start with Kelly and ask you to dive into dive down the rabbit hole that you started sliding into during your introduction, right? So, there's sort of blockchain technologies with different degrees of decentralization, et cetera, and then the broader potential of the DeSci world, DAOs, IPNFT tools to incentivize patients or scientists and kind of respect dignity across the value chain in ways that haven't been feasible at scale before. So, given these developments, what excites you about the implications for advanced therapies, right? And there's, cell gene therapies, but also digital therapeutics and all sorts in, wearables and hardware implants and, probably the most advanced cases in the coming years are going to be some combinations of all of the above, right? And so, yeah, just your thoughts on how that can accelerate innovation to, at the end of the day, ultimately help patients.
Yeah, absolutely. And Jason, I would say it's easier to answer the question, what am I not excited about in this space? Because there are so many things that are potentially impactful, but game-changing for this space. And I think that, we have a couple of factors really going for us in this space. I have probably the highest engagement of patients since we've seen, throughout the history of this space, partially aided by the pandemic and the growing presence of remote work and decentralized interaction and whatnot. But then we also have, many, many stakeholders who are attempting to innovate in the space and are innovating, but in silos. And I think we all know and can agree that innovation is only so impactful when done so in a silo. And so when I look at decentralized technologies, I see a mass amount of data being produced in silos, some connected, some suboptimally connected. Multi-stakeholder environment where it's very complex, trust is potentially in question depending on what the situation is. And so in my mind, those check a number of boxes for more of a distributed ledger type technology and some innovation as well. And so I'll get specific in a second here, but I do think that what we see is that, typically life sciences innovation does happen within a single stakeholder or perhaps dual stakeholder. But with the emergence of DeSci, I think that we have the potential to see more of a network effect as long as use cases layer up and are communicated and collaborated appropriately. And that's what I find most exciting. Being the former clinician that I am, I think we get out of bed in the morning because we want to make sure that patients ultimately benefit from the innovations that are occurring today. And so I think there are no shortage of potential use cases across drug discovery, development, and commercialization, throw med device in there, but then also, across stakeholders. But in my space that I'm in today, which is in cell and gene therapy, inclusive of rare and orphan conditions and whatnot, there are a number of use cases within the actual therapy administration timeline from the time that a patient is enrolled through the point where they're administered, likely within an acute setting, depending on the therapy, but there's manufacturing and supply chain, there's patient data, there's clinician education, and all of those are, and regulatory as well. All of those create unique challenges. But then we all know once the patient leaves the four walls of the hospital, these therapies need to be tracked for outcomes. I think the FDA guidance for gene therapies is up to 15 years. Mm-hmm. And so we know how much of a Wild West it can be once you leave and go back out into the community, into the real world. And so those are some areas that I really see are emerging pieces. They're large, complex puzzles, but over time can be connected to really make a difference in this space.
It's fantastic. Actually, earlier here we had a bit of a discussion about cell and gene therapy and not just the importance from a traditional pharmacovigilance perspective of that long-term monitoring, but because so often with rare diseases, especially with single or few gene mutations that are the low-hanging fruit in that space, other gene expressions, their phenotypes develop to try and cover for that the physiological problem that is a result. And then so you fix it, you might have 10 years into a child's life, you might have biological systems that actually developed in order to compensate, right? And those are the things that we can only learn with long-term, monitoring and making sure that we're capturing enough data streams beyond what we think we need to capture. Because the sponsors never want to capture anything they don't have to because it's risk. And then from the from the medical side, we don't know what we don't know, right? So that's really exciting. Gerald, I'm going to pass the ball to you, which is, more with your former VC hat in healthcare. Thoughts on and also the DeSci space, the DeFi space really well, and the kind of culture and ethos of the space, both really sort of progressive in some ways, but also kind of highly skeptical of rules. And so when at the end of the day, making sure that data or activities that might be coordinated in decentralized ways or meeting certain standards. Thoughts on the kind of compliance or standards that DeSci initiatives ought to be thinking about if they want their data to be valuable to drug developers or to clinicians in healthcare, nutritionists who are some of our efforts in DeSci are food as medicine and sort of non-patentable dietary innovations to improve health and financing via DeSci, DAOs and stuff, trials on that stuff. So, Gerald, thoughts on compliance and standards for a space that doesn't like to think about them?
Yeah, it's a really interesting question. I think one of the interesting aspects of a distributed ledger is sort of the inherent security. We can leave aside, I guess, things like bridges and sort of true DeFi products, right? Sticking to healthcare. The auditability of data on chain, and Jason, you and I have talked about this with what you guys are doing, sort of having that instant clinical level integrity in the data just through the technology is something that I think is really challenging for traditional healthcare investors to get their heads around. But I think one of the benefits of these DAOs and DeSci is the speed and the ability to coordinate and iterate kind of in this sandbox environment, right? And then actually be able to produce these outcomes in a way where there is integrity behind the data. When you start talking about things like SOC 2 compliance or HIPAA compliance, right? These are things where if events are happening on chain, they're not happening in a Cerner or an Epic kind of structure. I think it benefits everyone. I think there's a real issue that you highlighted with how fast I think we're able to innovate in this space. But the way we can use blockchain, I think there's the sort of compliance and the aspects that you're talking about, where we know that we have the right tools. We just have to get them in the hands of the right people, right? And so I think that's one of the things that I'm most excited to see, because one of the other things that I think is actually a shared issue between traditional healthcare and DeSci is usability, right? UX is incredibly challenging for the space. So you can have incredibly high auditable sort of clinical integrity level data. What I used to say when we were looking at electronic health records back when I had my VC hat on was, you have what boils down to the patient portal login problem, right? Like you have the highest density of valuable data that you're going to get is going to be from your least likely users. Mm-hmm. And so I think, what I kind of, people who are, you talked about nutrition, people are in sort of food deserts, maybe older people, maybe, fewer hospitals around them, than there used to be. I think if we can educate people and potentially use some of this distributed ledger technology to get that data, both from those patients, but also financially incentivize them, right? With not necessarily that healthcare data needs to be overly financialized. I think that's one kind of plot that gets misunderstood a little bit, and I think in the space. But yeah, I think having that replicability, the on-chain, viability of that data makes compliance in the space a lot easier. And then you get into, so that's sort of the healthcare side of things. And then you get into what is your token, right? And so that's like a much probably longer discussion, and we can stay away from the Howey test here, but that's I guess the other side, the added sort of challenge that we have, as a community right now in the United States.
Yeah, it is, especially this year. Kelly, a question for you then. And I'll just say to Gerald's question about over-financialization of health data, we had a discussion this morning with some health research ethicists about that, right? And one thing, Gerald, you've heard me be worried many times about, too libertarian a version of this, incentivizing people to harm themselves to pay rent, right? So but Kelly, what? So for some of the stuff you're talking about, particularly long term, one of the advantages that Gerald's teasing out in terms of the auditable data integrity, et cetera, is also cryptographically secure touch points with the patients longitudinally, right? And we at Remedy work on ever improving what we call our dynamic consent engine, right? Which is the ability to get consent to do multiple things early on, but most importantly, reapproach the patient over time with opportunities to change their consents, to consent to new things and so forth, in order to get that data enrichment with new data streams potentially, but also, we don't know what we don't know yet. But in 5 years, we might know what we don't know, and we might know how to ask the question that I couldn't get an IRB to approve a consent for 5 years earlier, right? So thoughts on dynamic consenting long-term relationships with patients, and we provide tech for that, but these are infrastructure components of what DeSci can be thinking about in order to be compliant all the way through.
Yeah, absolutely. And I would say, on the note of dynamic consenting, I think that holds great promise, especially from a patient experience angle. I know, and I'm sure we all know in this room as well, virtual and in person, that a number of clinical trial pieces are still done on paper, in email, or in, heaven forbid, like Excel files. I still recall enrolling patients for a gastroenterology trial that I was the lead on. And patients would say, well, I'm gonna sign this on this piece of paper, and then it's going to live forever in a file cabinet, and it will never be able to be changed. And for FDA regulations, I will not claim to be a legal professional, defer to Gerald. But largely that is true. It stays the same unless there is an amendment, and that is also on paper, and it requires those two papers to be stored together. Well, wouldn't that be a wonderful thing to be digitized to allow the dynamic change of that consent if it does alter even just slightly or entirely? And I would challenge this group, as we're talking about this, to think about patients' rationale behind that as well. Sometimes it's a lack of education or a lack of ability to ask questions, and so drives them completely to one side to say, I would like to withdraw. Whereas if we're able to actually engage patients along the way and demonstrate their participation, their impact in clinical research, for example, that it actually can continue to allow us to retain patients. Patient attrition is such an issue in this as well. And I've found, at least, and so I should say at the beginning, but this is my opinion rather than my company and my entity, but I do think that if patients are aware of the impact that they could be making on their condition, or one that impacted their family or someone that they know, that they're more likely, we're all human beings, right? They're more likely to stay in the loop and engaged. We just need to make sure that we are adequately communicating. And so for folks on the phone and in the room, thinking about things like how to connect the right stakeholders, including patients, early and often, to make sure that everyone's having those clear collaborative sessions as well.
And most, well, I think you two know, but I was a childhood cancer survivor, and I just got pinged. I'm part of a long-term follow-up study that I have been lazy at getting back in, logging in and updating. So I just got a very friendly phone call, to try and update that. I'll turn to Gerald, but Kelly, I know you might have a hard stop for a meeting, so if you have to hop off suddenly, thank you so much. And we all here really appreciate your contributions. Gerald, I want to ask you the liability question, right? Healthcare is super high stakes. It's not just legal liabilities that's at stake, right? It's brands and the market story of whether you, as you did your duty, by the patients or by the scientists or by whatever. And so in a world where liability clauses and indemnification clauses and so forth are so crucial to knowing who to call up if there's a problem and who to sue if the problem doesn't get fixed, in a world of DAOs and other decentralized, focused research organizations and other kind of new acronyms for decentralized activity, that sometimes are intentionally structured legally to avoid accountability by the law. What are your thoughts on how DeSci efforts, particularly those that will, let's say, rare disease patient DAO, gathering data and try and make it available to advance development of a drug for their disease? How do they need to be thinking about legal status of entities and liabilities and so forth? And if it's a crowd powered thing, like that isn't going to have a budget for liability insurance too, right? Like so you've been swimming in this stuff, so please share your wisdom with us.
Yeah, no, I'll go ahead and put that disclaimer out as well. So none of this is legal advice. Contact your own counsel, and tread carefully. You hit on, I think, one of the biggest issues that DAOs have right now is that democracy is messy at scale, right? So one of the best things that you can do to protect yourself when it's a very small group, right? So we're talking about some of these rare diseases, conditions, it's part of the beauty of DeSci is that these communities can get together and actually produce meaningful results and impactful relationships. But when you start to see those organizations expand, unfortunately, the broader crypto community has had its fair share of bad actors. And I would say that's one of the issues that you have to be mindful of in DeSci as well, right? It only takes one sort of really bad stakeholder to potentially kind of torpedo a project. And when you have money moving around and you have governance structures that are a little untested, you do unfortunately tend to attract people who can make bad decisions. And so I would say one of the first things that we spend a lot of time thinking about is what you mentioned with just getting that appropriate wrapper, right? Because one of the things, and so a DAO wrapper, for those in the room who aren't familiar, is basically an entity that houses your protocol.
I thought it was a hip hop artist because he said DAO rapper.
Yeah,
yeah.
That's that might be a 2024 group. But so one of the things that is very real in the space is you need to be able to sit on the other side of the table from someone in a contractual relationship way. You need some kind of an entity, even just to be able to work with external stakeholders, right? So that's one of the sort of first table stakes things that you need to do is have a structure in place that allows you to be legally recognizable, so that you can work with data or other providers or some of the organizations we've talked about. When you're looking at limiting liability from an operator perspective, so if you're involved in a DeSci DAO, looking at something like, and we've seen this with Oki and library in the United States, where essentially, Jason, if you and I decided to open a lemonade stand tomorrow and we go out and we set up shop and we start taking orders and money, even if we don't declare what we are, unfortunately, for better or worse, the U.S. government will tell us that we are a general partnership. That's what you've seen with some of these DAOs who decided not to have an entity. I would just say that that's not a loophole that exists. So, if you're getting advice that, somehow totally being off the grid makes you, not liable, I would just say that the U.S. government disagrees with that position, and the law abhors a vacuum.
Yeah.
So if you don't make these choices, the government will make them for you. So, be very mindful of who you're working with and how you're setting up, because it's much harder to fix once you're going than it is to do it right.
And what about, I want to push this in the direction of like healthcare enterprise, right? So one is like, do you owe Uncle Sam and will he throw you in jail, right? But even before that, like, say, a global, because again, part of what makes these DAOs revolutionary, particularly for rare diseases, where like, very few people are in one place, right, Kelly? But globally, you might be able to have a critical mass, right? And you crowdsource real world data, and you want someone to act on that, right? I could see the easiest path perhaps being first with an academic group, right? But certainly industry will be thinking about all these things. Like, okay, if I get your data and rely on it in any way, and otherwise there's no point in getting your data, right? The whole point is I'm going to somehow rely on it to do something valuable. All of a sudden these things matter, right? But so, what would your thoughts be in terms of, does that mean then, a global patient community DAO, finding an anchor legal structure in some jurisdiction that then has subsidiaries in other countries that then, again, so you end up with a very traditional legal chain of relationships so that, Pfizer is willing to take that data and use it to accelerate some discovery into your particular rare disease. Would that be kind of?
Yeah, I think that's one of the most attractive things about the DeSci space overall, in my eyes, is the way these communities can develop and branch and fork off of each other, right? So what you're talking about is maybe like a sub-DAO situation, or I mean, you've seen, Molecule. I don't know how many sub-DAOs Molecule has at this point, but I think that openness and the ability of the community to organize around the things they're passionate about, one, makes it easier to have these sort of kind of Hydra-like structures. But then also, to your point, one of the things that is important is to understand that local jurisdiction stuff. So, when you're talking about global engagement, it's much easier to have a local community. We're talking, a couple thousand miles away from each other, today, and I think that's very real in the Web3 and the DeSci space. So just being mindful, and I think having, like I said, having an eye on compliance early, especially with the level of sensitivity of some of the materials you're talking about, using or partnering with other organizations on, it really kind of, shameless plug, hire, a good lawyer, right? Because you're going to get into very interesting situations, and it's much more difficult to sort of course correct when you're already down the road, and you need to be complying with these, kind of very complex, traditional, sort of regulated environments.
Well, hire a good lawyer and use a multi-jurisdictional compliance data platform. Anyways, Gerald, I appreciate it so much. We all do here. Thank you so much. We got some catching up to do very soon, all right? Thanks for
Absolutely. Thank you so much.
Take care. This is fantastic.
Thanks, everyone.